I think we can go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Robert Johnson for part two of his two-part Grand Round series on addiction, behavior, neurobiology, and treatment. Part one was presented on October 28th of last year. I unfortunately was not here for the first presentation, being out of town, but I understand it received excellent reviews, and that's why we all wanted Dr. Johnson to return for part two. Dr. Johnson is a graduate of the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine and completed his residency at the Harbor UCLA Medical Center. During his career, he held a number of administrative positions, including that of Senior Medical Director and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at College Hospital in Costa Mesa, California. During part of his time, he also served as the Medical Director for the College Health IPA and later as President of a multi-physician private practice group. He also is a certified executive coach and a former president of a group providing leadership, training, and executive coaching to clients ranging from Sony, El Pollo Loco, Community Sector Services, Rockwell International, the U.S. Olympic Committee, and O'Neill Sports, among others. Currently, Dr. Johnson is the Medical Director of CR Tucson, an internationally known inpatient substance treatment program. He is also a former Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. His research interests and publications have included the areas of depression, psychosis, cholecystokinin and schizophrenia, immune function in psychiatric patients, and psychotherapy. His speaking engagements include a number of local, national, and international presentations. This afternoon, Dr. Johnson's presentation is entitled Part 2, Addiction, Unhealthy Risk-Taking, and Dry Drunk Behavior, Neurobiology, and Treatment. Dr. Johnson.
Hi, guys. Can I ask, how many were here for the first half of this? Okay. I'm going to take probably 5 or 6 minutes to sort of review some of the highlights. At least, I'm not going to get in a lot of depth, but I'm going to give you a quick flashback on some of the things we covered. I started with a couple of videos. One was clips of the Jackass movies. That was followed by clips from Man on a Wire. You know, Philippe Petit's crossing on a cable between the World Trade Centers in 1974. And so it raised, it raised the question of, actually then we went from that, so the issue around thrill-seeking to other types of risk-taking and its consequence. And it kind of raises the question, substance abuse, thrill-seeking, rules-breaking, rules-bending, blatantly self-destructive behaviors. What is this about, right? Why is that addictive pathway so sticky, and are there common biological and or psychological links? There's going to be some more videos in this as well. We're not going to start off with them today. But let me kind of go over quickly some of the things we talked about. These are some of the themes that we addressed. I'm going to hit on each of these bullets just for a minute. So we talked about the nature of addiction, biologically, the mesolimbic pathway predominantly, largely related to dopamine metabolism. The pathway that goes from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex. So virtually every drug of abuse, and in fact every process or behavioral addiction, ends up affecting dopamine metabolism. Sometimes not directly, and there's a lot of complexity that we're not going to revisit today. But this, this is sort of the core nut related to addiction. As addiction occurs when the pleasure and reward system in our brains get hijacked. So this is that central piece that in the end leads to all the sequelae of addiction. Craving, tolerance, continued use despite negative consequences, loss of control, rebound, withdrawal, okay, etc. Some of the research evidence for this being a predominantly dopaminergic issue. You guys are probably familiar with a lot of this self-stimulation research. The rats will self-stimulate either by implanted electrodes or by sucrose-laced drug substances or liquid, self-stimulate the VTA or nucleus accumbens, basically to the exclusion of everything else. So they will stay up all night and all day without eating or drinking, without having sex, basically until they die. In fact, I think the record we talked about last time for rats is pressing that lever 10,000 times per hour. Right? So think about that. Just how biologically reinforcing it is to produce that sort of behavior. And the truth, and this is the truth, that there's never enough pleasure to satisfy that pathway. When it's stimulated, there's no limit to the craving. It's a barrel without a bottom. It never gets full. The more you give it, the more it wants. And this is true both for process as well as for process or behavioral addictions as well as chemical addictions. So why is it that drugs and process addictions are, well, particularly drugs specifically right now, are more addictive than natural rewards that also increase dopamine release? Well, the truth is they release 2 to 10 times the amount of dopamine that natural rewards do. So not only are they more potent, but they also, the results happen immediately and they last a lot longer. So in the end, they end up dwarfing the results that are produced by more naturally occurring levels of stimulation, whether it's a great volleyball game or a good book or conversation or sex or a great meal. If you look at normal levels of dopamine release, if you look at percent of basal dopamine output, let's say in a given day or a given week, typically it goes between plus 200% and minus 200% release. What do you think happens when you add methamphetamine to that mix? Right? And this actually is conservative. So frequently it's between 800 to 1,200% greater dopamine release. So how can more physiologic levels of dopamine release compete? Right? It can't. So part of what happens is this is what hijacks that pleasure pathway. So that nothing except the most out-of-the-box experiences have any hope of surpassing that barrier to stimulate the pleasure center sufficient to make you feel alive. So tolerance, so if you look at brain reward during abstinence from all the major classes of abuse, what you see is increases in brain reward threshold. In other words, it takes a greater amount of drug or thrill to produce the same result. Trying to think of the example I gave last time. Actually, a case that just came in a couple days ago. We have a physician who came in on 375 milligrams of methadone. Right? I think the example I gave you last time was of a professional woman who came in on 10 to 12 Ambien per day, 10 milligram Ambien tablets, and 45 milligrams of Xanax. Right? So 1 milligram of Xanax is equivalent to 15 to 20 milligrams of diazepam. So she's almost on almost 500 milligram equivalents, right, of Valium, plus 10 to 12 Ambien per day. You go, what? How is that possible? Well, I'm feeling anxious. I take a pill. Anxiety reduces. Pill wears off. I feel anxious again. Maybe even worse, because now there's rebound and withdrawal in the mix. And I go, oh my God, I'm feeling anxious. I must need a higher dose. Right? And on it goes. It's exactly the same thing we see in chronic pain and opioid use. So just as we turn down the volume on a radio that's too loud, our brain responds, right, to that excessive drive, excessive level of stimulation by either producing less dopamine or by down-regulating the D2 receptors. Right? So as a result, dopamine's impact on that reward circuitry it becomes abnormally low. So our ability to experience any pleasure at all is reduced. Does that make sense? So the third piece is what I call death of willpower. In other words, that every drug of abuse is also neurotoxic. In fact, it preferentially kills brain cells that relate to volitional choice. So I've got an 18-lane highway in my brain right, at this point that's highly reinforced, the huge amount of craving going on because nothing else can, right, make me feel that same juice. I've developed tolerance. I need to keep upping the ante to achieve the same result. And now my brain has lost the ability to help me make that shift from that 18-lane highway from between me and alcohol or crack cocaine or purging or cutting to this little goat track of recovery mindset and practices over here. right? Even if I'm highly incentivized, right? So even if my teaching certificate, my law practice, my medical license is dependent on my getting and staying sober, right? My brain has lost the ability to help me, right, enact that choice. Example from UCLA, Paul Thompson, looking at methamphetamine abuse. So what you see is hippocampal volume reduction, right, that links in neuropsych testing to poor memory performance, but at the same time, what you see is a 7% volume increase because of the inflammatory response in the white matter. Because not only are these things neurotoxic, but the anti-inflammatory response they evoke is also neurotoxic. Does that make sense? So there's at least a double whammy. There's actually a triple. We won't get into that today. The next thing that happens is we start experiencing this deadening of motivation, joy, and pleasure, right? I think we're probably all familiar with the term anhedonia, right? Kind of difficulty feeling joy or pleasure. We use that term a lot in clinical depression, schizophrenia, other psychiatric syndromes. It is the rule rather than the exception in substance abuse. So hedonia is the experience of joy and pleasure. So what happens when we use drugs? Actually, the same thing with process addictions. Right? We engage in that behavior, what happens? We have an increase in hedonic tone. We feel good. Right? We may even feel euphoric. What happens when that wears off? Right? Unfortunately, it carries this tail with it of dysphoria, of anhedonia. What happens over time? Just like we talked about the example of Ambien, we start developing tolerance, so we get less and less of this good stuff. This tail gets deeper and wider, so pretty soon we're having to use just to get back to baseline. Right? What a terrible place to be. So the result is that excessive stimulation affects our pleasure system's ability to sustain a healthy level of hedonic tone. The result is that when we don't use, right, we're left feeling depressed, dissatisfied, unmotivated, which leads us to a desire to return to the drug for an additional fix. What do we do then? So because we're feeling sort of dead in the water, we turn to hedonic treadmills, where we have to keep kind of upping the ante, right? Jumping to the next kind of short-term mood booster to help us feel at least a modicum of pleasure. The problem is, in the long run, those hedonic treadmills can further sort of commandeer that pleasure system and completely gets washed out. So it actually contributes to the problem. And the last thing is what we see clinically is the persistence of this craving and these emotional and behavioral features, even during abstinence, which is what we call dry drunk behavior. Does that sort of catch up? So, question is, what's the solution to this process? How do we reclaim the neurobiological, emotional, and spiritual pathways that have been hijacked and lead to this addictive behavior? And is it possible to utilize those same pathways to build effective, purposeful, fulfilling, productive lives? That's going to be the theme for today's talk. So we're going to talk briefly about aspects of that solution in 6 domains: brain, mind, purpose, spirit, behavior, and emotions. We're going to start with brain. So, right, first thing I do is stop damaging your brain, right? I mean, so when I meet with patients, there's a couple things in terms of, you have voluntary control over how much toxin you put in your system. So this relates to drugs and alcohol, but also environmental toxins, right? So if you like painting your car in an unventilated garage, right, or that's your job, then you need to change that. Because the truth is our brains are very plastic, has the ability to recover and heal over time if you allow it. We also got to stop injuring it in other ways. I often use this: you have a Porsche brain, you got to stop treating it like a Pinto, right, or a Yugo. You got to respect it. So if you're going to snowboard, right, use a helmet. Don't let your kids just do headers in soccer. So just reassess your involvement in X Games sports, right? And I can't tell you, one of the things that we're finding a huge amount of, it's here at Tucson, both in terms of neuropsych testing as well as SPECT scanning, is the very high frequency of unsuspected TBI, traumatic brain injury, in these patients. Because what happens when you impair your prefrontal cortex is you're more impulsive, right, and more risk-taking. As a result, your risk for brain injury is substantially higher. The third is you have to dial down the level of unhealthy stimulation in your life, right? Rave parties, Game Boy, PS3, you got to turn it off, walk your body, not your iPod, even though I'm a huge iPod lover. Second step relates to lowering the stress in your life. So there's some researchers in Switzerland doing some research on mice. And what they showed is if you increase the level of stress, what you see is a linear increase in anhedonia, which is measured in rats and mice by the amount of consumption of sucrose and or self-stimulation in pleasure centers in the brain. And so the more the stress, the more those pleasure systems lost interest in pleasurable activities, even when stimulated directly. But it was restored when stress was reduced. Somebody familiar with Bruce Alexander's work, this rat park experiment? So in the late 70s, and he's a Canadian researcher at Simon Fraser. So he was looking at the research that utilized rats in isolated individual cages in which you'd set them up with morphine or cocaine-laced sucrose solutions. Because rats and mice have sweet tooth, right, just like we do. And the data that shows if you give these rats or mice access to addictive substances, they will get addicted. And so he's wondering how much of this is environmentally based. And so he's thinking, if I were confined 24 hours a day and was bored, lonely, and stressed, I'd want to get high too. Right? And so he builds a 200 square foot, what he calls rat heaven or rat park. Brightly colored, right? Paintings of trees, river. There's opportunities for procreation, for learning, for play. And what they found was that the animals who had access to this rat park had little or no desire for these morphine-laced sucrose solutions. In fact, they used 12 times less of that than the animals who were lonely and stressed and isolated. So one of the big themes here is that the more you encourage people to broaden their spectrum and get a life that provides an antidote, right, a counterweight, right, to that isolation, the better they do. Andy Newberg at Penn has written about the top things from a research standpoint that he thinks tracks to healthy prefrontal cortex functioning. We're going to hit on a couple of these. Smiling, staying intellectually active, learning conscious relaxation strategies, yawning. I'm not going to get into that today, but there's actually 35 studies on yawning and the beneficial effects. It actually stimulates the precuneus, and it's involved in the folds of the parietal lobe that relate to self-awareness. Meditation, aerobic exercise, dialoguing with others, and faith. Let's look at a couple of these. So, smiling versus laughter. Smiling actually stimulates circuitry that enhances empathy, mood, social interaction, sense of community. Frowning stimulates what? Anger, disgust, dislike. So if we look at, we've heard about research, probably in chronic illness related to laughter's beneficial effects on immune functioning. It's actually that literature is sort of mixed because laughter actually stimulates different neural pathways that are related to surprise and a sense of incongruity. So it actually stimulates the amygdala, suggesting that those feelings are sometimes at least related to discomfort and fear rather than pleasure. So if you think about why we laugh when we're looking at this blatantly self-destructive behavior on these jackass movies, this is why, right? What we're doing is we're watching videos, watching people do stupid things, right? It's a way of our brain releasing anxiety or tension. Does that make sense? Aerobic exercise. Virtually all forms of exercise enhance neural performance. This is post-TBI, post-stroke. Here's examples of how aerobic exercise makes a difference. As we said, repairs and protects from neurologic damage, not only by stress, but also by injury or stroke. Enhances brain plasticity. Enhances immune functioning. is just as effective as antidepressants. Multiple studies show this, right? It doesn't mean you avoid antidepressants, but piggybacking them together can make a dramatic difference in response. It's as effective as 12 sessions of psychodynamic psychotherapy for depression. It's protective versus Alzheimer's disease. And like we saw up here in the immune functioning, it reduces vulnerability to chronic illness. Intellectual stimulation. So strengthens neural connections throughout your frontal lobes that has more connections than any other lobe in your brain. So virtually every age-related cognitive disability, right, is related to the functioning of our frontal lobes. So it's really important to exercise this. In fact, if you just mind your own background, when you think back historically, when you were feeling most in flow, okay, plugged in, excited, on a learning and growth edge, had great energy, what were you doing? Right? Were you trying to fix something that was not working in your life? Or were you building something? Right? So really, when you think about these, if you just sort of reflect on what helps you get in that sweet spot, it's really, there's a number of good pointers to say what you want to encourage in the structure of patients' lives. We're going to get into some coaching themes in a couple minutes, but game playing, right? The more intense and frequent the game playing, the better, with a couple of exceptions. The literature around video game playing is actually getting more mixed because there's more studies coming out. So there actually are some game playing situations that can be healthy for growth and development of prefrontal cortex functioning. There are some moves, even for example, on the Wii. On snowboarding, for example, you actually can work and develop moves that you actually can perfect on the slopes. But I think a big part of the problem here is really related more to the isolation and obsessionality and preoccupation that happens with these games as opposed to actually playing the games. So, in other terms of brain health, we got to reclaim those pleasure pathways. So, because the truth is that a person can recover from anhedonia by changing their lifestyle in ways that lowers their dependence on those out-of-the-box states of excitement. So this is going to be a theme, this hedonic rehabilitation is going to be a theme that's increasingly important in addiction recovery treatment, is it's important to build in alternative healthy levels of stimulation in recovery. Softball, volleyball, kayaking, books, conversations, because we have to reclaim that pleasure center and help kind of retrain it to be responsive at lower levels of dopaminergic tone. Cultivating type B pleasures, sort of a synonym for that. Because our brain simply was not designed to enjoy constant high levels of stimulation. It prefers a little high, a little low, right? Because if excitement goes up and stays high at that level, exactly that tolerance process happens. The brain acclimatizes and needs a higher level of stimulation to satisfy those numbed centers. So what medications can be helpful? Psychostimulants, right? Ritalin, Dex, Adderall, Concerta, Vyvanse clearly activate prefrontal cortex functioning. Some of the activating antidepressants, modafinil, atomoxetine, L-tyrosine. It's involved in it's metabolized from phenylalanine and is in the metabolic pathway toward norepinephrine and dopamine. Omega-3 fatty acids. Lots of great data the last 10, 12 years. We've always known that fish oil is healthy for cardiac function, decreases lipids, cholesterol, and enhances pump function. It's good for skin, for joints, for hair, but great data across the board in schizophrenia and ADHD and depression for brain health. Some non-pharmacologic approaches to renewing brain health. I wish this thing disconnected. It's hard to kind of stay here. EMDR, neurofeedback, biofeedback, coaching, right? Learning, where to sit in a classroom, how to orient your desk at work so you're less distracted. Activities requiring coordinated movement, dancing, ping pong playing, music. Virtually all the drugs of abuse are also vasoconstrictors, as is caffeine and alcohol. So when you do functional imaging on people who are using drugs and alcohol, that's part of why you see such a vivid response, because they're having a constricted blood flow. HBOT treatment. This make sense? Sorry, I wish we could spend more time on these. But look, so this is kind of a fun area. So mind. It's really critical and very powerful to give patients accurate and powerful frames for the nature of their struggle, because they're going to identify and see their own experience through it, and it's going to generate hope and commitment and momentum. Howard Gardner, on the most basic level, a change of mind involves a change of mental representation. So we talked about these are frames, right, that we talked about. So I think it's actually helpful at the developmental level. It's appropriate for your patient to teach them a little bit about each one of these things, and because they get it pretty quickly, in fact, because they're living this life. It's not abstract to them. It's also very helpful to show these things to family members as well. What it tends to evoke, it shifts the conversation away from sin and character and bad apple conversations to more of a neurobiological conversation, and tends to elicit more compassion and patience and affection. A couple of metaphors. Prefrontal cortex is the brain's charioteer, right? It's trying to control two horses, right? Our noble impulses and those unruly passions. We talked about last time how brain development goes from back to front, right? What develops first is those mesolimbic pathways. So craving develops long before a filter, right? That you can push those cravings through in order to sustain, focus on long-range goals. I think I like this one the best, captainship. So the POC is not the undisputed captain of the ship. It is up on the bridge, right? It's planning and making decisions, but there's always grumbling below decks from the more primitive layers of the brain who were on board long before the neocortex showed up. Right? Is that true? You're familiar with the notion of contrary action in 12-step world, right? This thing that, particularly in early in recovery, your first impulse is likely to be the wrong one. In fact, 180 degrees opposite of what you probably should do. So if I relapse on drinking, what is my initial impulse? To go to a meeting and share and get the support and encouragement that I need? And no, it's what? To isolate, to pull away, right? To hide because I'm ashamed, and so I can't go back until I'm sober again, because otherwise I will have disappointed them, right, in addition to being ashamed for myself. So if people get this as a swing thought, if they really understand that their first impulse really is likely to be 180 degrees opposite of what they should do, it can revolutionize their lives. Let me show you a quick video.
My disease isn't alcoholism or drug addiction or self-centeredness. My disease is called first thought wrong. I was born with it, I'll die with it. In between, I try to manipulate it the best I can. First thought guaranteed incorrect or impolite or inappropriate or cruel or self-centered, criminal, some form, fashion, even a fraction of first thought wrong. That doesn't mean my second thought's right. Some days it takes me 5 or 6 or 10 to get to nice or human or kind. First thought guaranteed wrong. So they said they were going to film. My first thought was, oh my God, a camera adds 10 pounds. Look at all the women. Oh my God. The men are going, so? What? Well, I'm as weight conscious as anybody else. I used to weigh 90 pounds more than I do right now. 10 years ago, I got tired of being the fat guy. I got tired of taking food into my anatomy at 3 in the morning, not because I was hungry, but because I was empty. There's a huge difference. But they told me they were filming. They said, we're going to film. I said, camera adds 10 pounds, there's 4 cameras. I got to get back to my crack smoking weight immediately. That's a joke, let it go. First thought wrong, if one of you walks by me and doesn't say thank you, I'll go back to my hotel room and I'll shoot heroin into my neck. And it'll be your fault! That's a joke, let it go. Let it go. I would never use my neck. That's idiotic. That's stupid.
Mark is great. We bring him out for alumni reunion every year. If you have a chance, hire him. He's fantastic. Purpose. there are, as mentioned, I'm board certified in psychiatry and addiction medicine, but I also been doing a lot of it. I went through a year-long coaching certification program about 10 years ago, and so I was doing a lot of executive coaching work. There's a lot of really powerful tools and concepts in that coaching domain that have real clinical power. Let me introduce you to a couple of them because they're really relevant in addiction treatment. Because what we want to do is we want to facilitate a shift from a purpose or problem focus to a vision focus. Andy Newberg again, nurturing a fantasy is the first step in the neural process of achieving success in the world. It begins with a creative imagination, a process that takes place in your frontal lobe, the area in your brain that has the unrelenting capacity to dream up virtually anything. If you can't imagine a specific goal, you won't make it to second base, which is figuring out how to make your dream come true. What does the prefrontal cortex do? Its main job is to translate your intention into behavior. So what you need is two things. You need a healthy prefrontal cortex, and you need a goal. But how much time do we spend with patients helping them articulate what they're for, not just what they're against? I love this quote by Robert Fritz. It's not what the vision is, it's what the vision does. It's more important to have a vision than to get the content of that vision perfect. Because vision has structural power. Let me show you a diagram that's very helpful. I call this a gap diagram. Current state down here, desired state up here, right? Life as it is. This is who I want to be and what I want to be doing. Where do we spend most of our time in psychotherapy? If not all of our time. Right? Right here, right? It's all about what isn't working. And the problem is, at least in this lifetime, there's going to be no end to being human. Right? We're never going to be short of impairments, vulnerabilities, imperfections. So this becomes an annuity, right? We can spend our entire career there. But where's the motivational battery or engine in this diagram, in this structure? Right? It's right here. But how much time do we spend making this compelling enough that people are willing to slog through the resistance, right? Because without this, well, I'll tell you what I find clinically. If this is the point, first of all, this isn't the point. The point isn't simply to get abstinent, right? It's to have a life that fills you with awe and joy and gratitude, right, and fulfillment. What I find is without this piece, that we just end up spending days, weeks, months, years working through this resistance that is in this gap. When you allow a little bit of time to do this, what I find is that these resistances either melt away, or the patient has the energy and the motivation to work through them because now that work is in the service of something they want more. Does that make sense? So there's actually positive, healthy structural tension in this gap. Right? Tension seeks what? Resolution. Right? So what we want to do is enhance this gap, not shrink it. Right? Our job initially is not to resolve anxiety, okay, existential anxiety, it's to increase it. So their motivation to actually, right, get healthy is high. Stephen Covey, all things are created twice, a mental or first creation, a physical or second creation. Most endeavors that fail with the first creation. So the truth is, this is sort of a mantra of mine, it's not enough to say no, right? It's not enough to overcome a bad habit or stabilize an illness. That health is not just saying no to all the voices and values and impulses that are contrary to your values. It's figuring out what to say yes to so completely, right, that all those other competing voices are drowned out. So one of the biggest challenges we have, and actually that really facilitates the work, is this: is asking patients this question, right? Not only who do you not want to be, what do you want to do less of? How do you be less bad, right? But what are you going to say yes to? Yeah. I love this quote by Peter Senge. When people truly discover some aspect of their vision and have the opportunity to dedicate themselves to working on it, when they can tell the truth and focus on aspirations instead of on being less bad, when they can be all of who they are, right, then something changes. And inner alignment starts to develop that can release extraordinary energy and creativity. People can start to bring all of themselves to their endeavor. This is why the coaching model, is exciting and energizing to do, right, as opposed to draining. Anybody have experience with that? Peter Block. So how do we get to what matters? What matters is shorthand for giving our lives to those things that are worth doing. It prioritizes aim over speed. How do we get to what matters? Here's some questions that are very fruitful for patients. What's the crossroads, the transition that you find yourself in at this point in your life? What are the changes, either in your motivation, in your heart, or in your environment, that got you to this transition? What's most important to you now? How has that changed? What no have you been postponing saying? What commitment are you willing to make? In other words, what's the price you're willing to pay to achieve that new thing? And what's your contribution to the problem you're concerned with? Let's look at a couple of these just for a second. The refusal question is, the truth is, if we can't say no, then yes means nothing. We have to make a decision about what we're not going to recreate. Does that make sense? That's where you start this conversation. What commitment are you willing to make? The truth is that every project, anything that matters, is going to require more of us than we originally thought. Because for anything that matters, timing's never quite right, resources are short, people who affect the outcome are always ambivalent. Did you find that in academia as well? I sure did. What's the price you're willing to pay? The truth is there's a cost to pursuing what matters, and money is the least of it. All of that's the first thing they're going to throw up. What's your contribution? This question is the antidote to people's helplessness, right? Because it affirms that we have, it's sort of like the fourth and fifth step. It affirms that we've had a role in creating the world we want to live in. It also shifts the accountability. It gets us out of the audience and onto the stage. So the other thing that's very, very helpful is developing a learning contract and doing this early in the game rather than late. Because it moves us away from contemplation into commitment. So as you make a public declaration of that intent, it mobilizes all kinds of not internal and external resources. Contracting is the work. That's the truth. 90% of the work is getting people to slow down long enough to own what's most important for them. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to lose their ability to lean into some of the trade-offs that are going to be necessary, some of the costs they're going to have to accrue in order to achieve that new thing. So let's talk about, we talked about sort of education, the role of education, healthy frames, vision, biological realities. Let's put these together for a second. It's an intervention with patients. So this area of your brain, when working well, helps you set priorities and goals and choose between competing impulses in the service of those priorities and goals, right? What quality of decisions do you think spring from a frontal lobe that looks like that? What do you think they say? Right? If our prefrontal cortex helps us maintain goal-directed behavior, particularly when weak but healthy impulses are in competition with stronger, unhealthy ones, right? Exactly like when recovery goals compete with craving or yearning for short-term pleasures, then some questions arise. What do you really want? What desires or impulses are competing for expression with that goal in your life? How aware have you been about that competition? And what's been winning out? Is your vision, is what you say is most important enough to forego short-term temptations and pleasures so your brain has a chance to heal and develop healthier pathways, right? What support are you going to need in the process? So we're going to see how we're starting to shift the conversation away from an impairment-focused dialogue to really about who are you, what are you for, and how can we facilitate the accomplishment of that goal. Spirit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the truth is that, well, actually, I'll show you just from several quotes. So William Moyers, son of journalist Bill Moyers, I have an illness with origins in the brain, right? But I also suffered with the other component of this illness. I was born with what I call a hole in my soul, a pain that came from the reality that I just wasn't good enough. I wasn't deserving enough. You weren't paying enough attention to me. Maybe you didn't like me enough. for us addicts, recovery is more than just taking a pill or getting a shot. It's about the spirit and about dealing with that hole in the soul. Now, most of us have a hard time talking about spirituality because we bring sort of a lot of religious baggage to that dialogue. I don't know anybody who doesn't. But this is a challenge that AA has had to struggle with from day one. Letter by Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of AA in 1940. During the past 12 months, we've had quite a number who felt that the fellowship, there was the helpful attitude, basically a meeting attendance, right? Helpful attitude toward others, the warming of the heart at social gatherings was going to be sufficient to overcome the alcoholic's obsession. But when we took stock at year's end, we found that this school of thought had a few survivors. Right? We have been persuaded before that we must find some sort of spiritual basis for living, else we die. We believe that faith without works was dead. Now we've conclusively proved that works without faith is dead also. Right? Let's put some data behind that. When he's trying to get AA started, this is early in their development, they actually did AA in different cities with and without this spiritual component. And what they found was, I want you to be successful. We used to pussyfoot around the spiritual business a great deal more here in New York City, and the results were bad. Our record was only half as good, most of the difficulty being directly attributable to temporizing over what it really took to fix the drunks. In other words, the spiritual. So you just have to help people in their own language find some type of higher power that they can help them get out of their own way, that helps support, inform, and equip them to walk out that intention. Behavior. So what's our goal behaviorally? It's not just to change behavior, right? Let's quote, if you cut the rattles off a rattlesnake, it's still a rattlesnake. So our goal isn't simply behavioral change, because obedience and compliance are inferior priorities. What our goal is to shift their overall state of being, shift their whole development curve up into the right, if you know what I mean. Because we're not just inviting them to be nicer versions of their old selves. How many people have much experience in working with addicts? Process addictions as well as chemical addictions. One of the things you find is that they engage. They're always the kind of misbehavior that goes on is challenging. Blowing smoke in your face, not coming to meetings, missing appointments. Right? It's a challenge personally as a doc or as a therapist. Our patients are professional mistake makers. Let's see where we're at. So we need some perspectives, some tools to respond to that anxiety-provoking behavior in such a way that it keeps us engaged. We don't want to simply play whack-a-mole. Right? Remember that game? So the goal is to help transform patients who are still in their disease, a term you hear a lot, which basically means the patient's focus is on battling problem behavior to getting clean and sober, which really is what? It's about that they're stable, behaviorally stable, no longer centric around addressing craving, but really on managing their freedom. So don't be a donkey, right? Dumb animals need an external control system. So don't be a dumb animal. If you act like a donkey, I'm going to have to treat you like a donkey. If I treat you like a donkey, you'll act like a donkey. Have you have experience with that with kids or patients? If I build an external control system around you, then you'll depend on it, and it won't be able to remove it from you because you won't be able to control yourself, and it will have handicapped you for life. So the goal is to develop that that internal locus of control. Because often we put people in a position where they only have two options, either complying or rebelling, neither one of which produces that internal state that we want to. So that the gains are not going to be sustainable. I'm going to skip through some of this. Anybody familiar with Annie Lamott, the writer? The 5 Rules to Perfect Happiness, as dictated by the 35 voices that hate you and seek your destruction. Right? Don't have anything wrong or different about you. If there's something different about you, correct it as soon as possible. If you can't fix that thing, at least pretend it's not there, disguise it as something else, or distract people from its existence. If you can't hide it or disguise it, at least hide it from view. If you still insist on showing up and being a part of things, have the decency to be ashamed. So a lot of what we focus on is around self-regulation skills. A lot of times in treatment, this is the first time in people's lives they've had the opportunity to learn how to self-soothe, how to self-regulate emotions, physiology, behavior, and cognitions. Because if you come back to healthy frontal lobe activity, it's really about being able to say no to, in some ways, to modulate impulses that really shoot your future in the foot. So this is a critical set of skills. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on this today, because there's a couple things I want to get to. You have a lot more in your handout that I'm going to cover today. So if the goal is managing your freedom rather than just getting abstinent, right? Our task is to transform right frames, right information, and right motives into automatic responses in patients' real-life situations. That only happens if we treat them as a three-dimensional person, right? Mind, body, spirit. And I think this is sort of the advanced spiritual condition. That integration is what AA speaks to and hopes for. So we don't just need a curriculum for abstinence, we need a curriculum for abundance. And what does that look like when someone gets it, when they're at that place where they're actually living out of their freedom? That's quoted by Stephen Nachmanovich. A girl riding her bike discovers the secret of effortless control is balance, continuous adjustments of continuous change. When she reaches that point of shouting, "Look, Ma, no hands," right, she's learned that she can use less and less means to control greater and greater power. She's learned to encounter and consciously play with rhythm, timing, weight, balance, geometry, right and left-handed coordination. And she does this by herself from her own body. Right? This is good. The emotions attendant on such a discovery are fear, right, of that newly found capability and freedom, delight, pride, disbelief, elation, and a desire to try it again and again. Right? Does anybody know anybody who's sort of in recovery? I mean, who's in stable recovery? Right? This is the sort of pride and exhilaration, right, that they experience. So I think the next one, yeah. I'm going to come back to Philippe Petit, who we started with. So we showed initially how Philippe stepped out 1,350 feet above the sidewalks in Manhattan, right? 110 stories high, 200 feet between the buildings. And asked the question, is this performance art? Is it pathological risk-taking? Or is it some expression of some psychopathology? I don't know if you remember your vote. But let me show you a couple clips, and I'm going to have you re-vote.
I start walking as a wire walker who is studying his cable. And instead of doing an entire study of the cable for the whole lens, seeing the first cavity and keep walking, seeing the middle, which is so soft and treacherous, seeing the second cavity, how it is, no, I do only go to the first cavity and I know enough. Now I'm going to perform.
I saw his face changing. He was very tense, and all of a sudden there was something like a relief in him. And from that time I thought, that's it. He's secure, it's good. And wow, that's...
J'ai vu Philippe. J'ai vu Philippe là-haut et c'était extraordinaire. C'était tellement, tellement beau. C'était comme s'il marchait sur un nuage. Et il y a eu des moments extraordinaires. Il s'est couché. Et ça, c'était l'extase de voir cette image de Philippe couché là-haut. Et puis l'autre moment très très fort, c'est quand il vous sur les traits. C'était tellement beau. Et quand il s'est agenouillé, il y a un moment où il s'est agenouillé et il a salué.
I sit down on the wire in one of my crossing, and I did something that amazed people. I actually look all the way down to look at something that I will never in my life see again.
So let's vote. How many see this as creative, courageous performance art? How many feel that there's at least some of the elements we've talked about today? Some dangerous thrill-seeking that reflects elements of a hijacked pleasure system in the flight from anhedonia by this hedonic treadmill. Anybody? Anybody vote for both? Well, I'm hesitant to show you the next slide. What do you think happened, for those of you who are not familiar with the story, when he was released by police that morning? He betrayed his long-term girlfriend by having wild sex in a hotel room with a female reporter he met at the police station. He didn't reconcile with his close friends or fiancée for years. You want to revote? Now, truthfully though, I don't know how I would come down, right, from walking between the two World Trade Centers. I mean, I'm in awe of this. I think this is performance art, but I think there clearly are also mixtures, right, of a lot of the themes we've talked about as well. So the truth is, in this lifetime, we're never going to be, more than human, right? Motives, particularly creative motives, are probably always going to have some mixture between false self-needs and creative expression. But I don't know if there's anybody else on the planet who could have done what he did that day. Anybody happen to see this actually won an Academy Award for Best Documentary? There's a crack up because he wasn't the producer of the movie, but when they won the award, producers were down, they called him down from the audience. He was in the building. He's a short, wiry guy, and he came down, and he's just a clown. And he grabs the statue that's really heavy, and he balanced it on his nose, right, upside down in front of the audience like this. He just is a crack up. So that's about all I wanted to cover for today, guys, given the time. Thanks so much. We have like 2-3 minutes. Any questions, feedback?